Good afternoon, and thank you so very much for joining us. My name is Nancy Conrad, and I serve as chair of the PBA diversity team. Along with our co-chairs, Melinda Gallarde and Phil Yoon, as well as the PBA diversity officer, Trent Hargrove, we welcome you to this program on race and reform. As we noted previously, it is our intent to enter into many conversations and to include very diverse topics in our conversations. We have taken on many new initiatives this year with the diversity team, and we thank you for partnering with us. In addition to programs of this nature, we are working in collaboration with our many other committees and sections in the PBA that have diversity as one of their priorities. And I want to remind you about upcoming programs and encourage your continued participation. On September 25th, there will be a program on diversity and inclusion, best practices for working in the COVID-19 environment. And our diversity officer, Trent Hargrove, will be moderating that program. I also encourage you to attend the PBA Virtual Diversity Summit that will be held on October 7, 2020. This is a full day program with 6.5 ethics credits and will cover many areas of diversity. I encourage you to attend all or even at least part of the summit. Today, our program will focus on the conversation as we continue in this area of race and reform. I sincerely want to thank our moderator and our representatives who are from law enforcement and advocates for social justice. They will address issues related to policing in our communities and what reform may look like. Our moderator, Teri Ravenell, is an associate dean for faculty research and development and a professor of law at Villanova School of Law. She joined Villanova in 2006 and began serving as associate dean in June of 2019. She teaches civil procedure, we all remember those days, criminal procedure, civil rights litigation, and police conduct. Her scholarship focuses on Section 1983, the federal civil remedy for constitutional deprivations, and examines the points at which Section 1983 jurisprudence converges with other areas of law. She is an expert on qualified immunity, municipal liability, and federal rights, civil rights litigation. Her recent article that brought her to our attention focuses on safe policing for safe communities. And I encourage you to read the article as a follow-up to today's program. There will be another listing of resources at the end of the program, and we encourage you likewise to continue the conversation. I'm pleased to turn the program over to our moderator, Professor.
Thank you so much, Nancy. First and foremost, I just want to thank the Pennsylvania Bar Association for spearheading this series of conversations regarding race and the law. And a very special thanks to Sharon Lopez for inviting me to moderate this third discussion being offered in the series. And a special thank you to our panel members and our audience for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to a dynamic discussion. Our discussion today is going to proceed in 4 different parts. I'm going to take a few moments at the beginning to frame our discussion. And then after briefly introducing our panel, I'll lead us through a guided discussion by posing a series of questions about police and police reform to our panel members. Then we will open up our discussion to questions from the audience. So on June 25th, 2020, the PBA held the first conversation in this series. 3 attorneys shared their experiences of being Black attorneys in America. And I recently listened to this conversation, which is available on YouTube, and I would encourage all of you to take the time to do so as well. And the sharing of lived experiences of Black members of the Pennsylvania Bar was just such a powerful way to start this series. Then 1 month later, the PBA held a CLE for government attorneys on diversity in government. And this CLE focused on cultural competency and attracting diverse candidates, which brings us to today's conversation, policing and police reform. And as I said, I want to spend just a few minutes framing today's conversation before we turn to our panel. So during the week of May 25th, most of us saw a horrific video. The world witnessed an almost 9-minute video of police killing George Floyd, an unarmed Black man, as he pleaded politely for his life. It was truly horrifying, but it wasn't the first or second or even third time that we had seen a video of police killing a Black male. As most of you probably remember, before George Floyd, there was Eric Garner and Tamir Rice, Laquan McDonald, and Philando Castile, all unarmed Black males. And I can't say Black men because Tamir Rice was only 12 years old when he was killed in a park with a toy gun, and Laquan McDaniel was just 17 years old when he was killed by Chicago police. And all of these Black males were killed by police, and all of it was caught on video. So what's interesting is that most Black Americans view police differently than their white counterparts. In 2015, Americans were asked, quote, "How serious a problem do you think police violence against the public is in the United States?" End quote. In 2015, only 32% of white Americans polled said that the problem of police violence was extreme or very serious. This is compared to 73% of Black Americans who answered that question and indicated that they thought that police violence was extreme or very serious. But George Floyd's killing may mark a turning point in our country. The protests following Floyd's murder were geographically widespread and attracted more diverse participants than many civil rights sort of marches, protests, demonstrations in the past. The New York Times reports that in the weeks following Floyd's death, at least 15 million people participated in demonstrations over his death. And furthermore, a Pew Research Center survey shows that Black Americans only accounted for 17% of those who say they attended a protest focused on race or racial equality in the late spring or early summer. Hispanic Americans accounted for 22%, Asian Americans accounted for 8%, and white Americans accounted for 46% of the people who said they attended a protest focused on race or race equality during this time period. And equally telling, when asked the same question, how serious a problem do you think police violence against the public is in the United States, this past June, 48% of white Americans polled said they thought the problem of police violence was extreme or very serious. So this is a significant increase from 5 years earlier. And additionally, 83% of Blacks polls answered the question in this way. And this is a big shift since 2015 when the question was initially posed. And so a comparison of these survey results suggests 3 important points. First, that Black Americans are more likely than their white counterparts to believe the problem of police violence is very serious. Nevertheless, this gap is shrinking, and overall, the number of Americans, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, who believe that police violence is a very serious problem is increasing. And these trends aren't just limited to Americans' views of police, but apply to the criminal justice system as a whole. More Americans are concerned about the disparate impact our criminal justice system has on people of color. And in short, it just looks like we're coming into agreement that our criminal justice system needs to be more just and less discriminatory, that it's in need of reform. And while our criminal justice system consists of lots of different actors, many of whom have caught the attention of the news in recent months, from persons who call the police to judges who issue criminal sentences, most recent reform proposals have focused on the police. During the last 4 months, we've seen numerous examples of proposals or actual police reform. President Trump issued an executive order calling for, quote, safer policing for safer communities. The House of Representatives passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and the Justice Act was introduced in the US Senate. Last but not least, on July 7th, the PBA diversity team, chaired by our own Nancy Conrad, drafted and successfully presented a recommendation to the PBA Board of Governors addressing police reform measures. On July 14th, 2020, Governor Tom Wolf signed House Bills 1841 and 1910, which specifically address police reform in the Commonwealth. The Pennsylvania Senate has also passed bills that would ban the use of chokeholds and mandate use of force policies. And at this point, I just want to take an opportunity to note that when we talk about police reform, we often talk about how government officials police. But the flip side of this coin is police accountability. That is whether police are held accountable for their conduct. And earlier today, a grand jury indicted former Louisville police officer Brett Hankinson on first-degree wanton endangerment charges for his actions on the night of that Breonna Taylor was killed by police. He was not indicted on charges for her actual death. 2 other officers at the shooting were not indicted at all. This, of course, comes on the heels of a historic $12 million settlement of the family's wrongful death lawsuit. And during that civil settlement, the city also agreed to enact police reforms, which include things like social workers to provide support on certain police runs and requiring commanders to review and approve search warrants before seeking judicial approval. And so here we are today, continuing this important conversation regarding race and police reform, and really thinking about sort of where we are and where we want to go. And as you'll see, we have a really diverse panel here today. We come from various settings, and not surprisingly, our opinions about these matters will vary. But we have one thing in common. We, like you, come today to engage in an honest, open discussion about the current state of race and policing in our country. These are complicated questions that weigh heavily on each of us, and we do not take these matters lightly. These are fundamental concerns. They concern the lives, liberties, and dignity of people of this country. So after I introduce our esteemed panel members, I'm going to start the conversation with a series of questions. Each panel member will have an opportunity to answer. And like I said, this will be sort of a guided discussion, and then we will open it up to a conversation with the audience. You can use your chat function to pose your questions, and I anticipate that what we will have is a dynamic but respectful conversation. And we may not all agree, but we should value one another's as individuals and act in accordance with this shared respect. So today I'm joined by a truly esteemed panel, and I'm just flattered to be a part of it at all. So first, I'm going in alphabetical order, not in order of preference. So Matthew Vogel, Matt is the district attorney for Franklin County. He assumed this position in 2009, and as such, he is the chief law enforcement officer for the county. And when he assumed this position, he agreed, quote, to do the right thing for the right reasons. On June 7th, Matt issued a letter stating unambiguously that Black Lives Matter. The chairman, and this letter did not come without repercussions for Matt and his career. The chairman of the Franklin County Republican Party has censored Matt for his statement, and we look forward to Matt in this unique position as a district attorney, him speaking with us today. Next is Corporal Timothy J. Greene. He is with the Pennsylvania State Police. Corporal Greene serves as a Heritage Affairs Liaison Officer with the Pennsylvania State Police. The mission of the Heritage Affairs section is to build relationships with historically underserved communities throughout the Commonwealth and to work with local law enforcement agencies to prevent and investigate hate and bias-related crimes. Section members also lead the department's training on implicit bias and awareness and de-escalation techniques. And so as you might imagine, Corporal Greene is on the cutting edge of police reform and particularly how it affects underserved communities. Kelley Hodge is a partner at Fox Rothschild. Kelley is an accomplished litigator, trial attorney, and compliance advisor with 2 decades of experience. She was the first African-American woman to lead the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office in its 167-year history. She's also taught at both Drexel Law School and the University of Pennsylvania's Law School. And last but not least, Riley H. Ross III. Riley is a partner at Mincey, Fitzpatrick, Ross. He's an experienced trial lawyer with nearly 20 years of trial and litigation experience. Before forming the law firm Mincey, Fitzpatrick, Ross, Mr. Ross served as an assistant federal public defender in Norfolk, Virginia, and was an attorney with several large law firms. Mincey Fitzpatrick Ross regularly represents plaintiffs in civil rights matters, including victims of police violence. And I would be remiss if I did not say that perhaps Riley's crowning achievement is that he also married me. And so I have a very special relationship with all of our panel members, but especially Riley. So, you know, as I said, I now want to turn to our sort of panel discussion. And I want to start off talking about the role of police, because during the past few months, we've all heard a lot of talk about police reform. But I think before we can really talk about reforming the police, we need to understand the role police play in our country and what exactly police do. And so I start off with this first question, which is really quite simply, what do police do? And I will open up the floor. And actually, you know, I think that in this occasion, perhaps Corporal Greene, it makes the most sense to start with you, and then we can sort of go from there.
Okay. All right, thank you for having me. It's very simple. We're there to serve and protect, and it even goes further than that. We have to work with the community in reference to building a stronger relationship, and that goes through education and also communication. They're the 2 biggest things. And basically, we're there as a guardian. Instead of having the warrior type mentality, we have to be there as a guardian as well, because you're going to see people at their worst times when we're dealing with people within the community and other agencies. So the foundation of what we are as police officers, what we need to be doing on a daily basis.
Do any of our other panel members want to add to that? Matt, I know that you have a special position with police officers. How would you sort of describe their role and your own role as Chief Law Enforcement Officer of Franklin?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for including me today. It's truly an honor. I've made some new friends. I really appreciate that. I'm totally outclassed today, and I'll try to do as best I can. So I have a big sign in the middle of my office that says "One team, one fight," and sort of the cultural atmosphere here is that we all work together towards one good, and that team concept expands, beyond the DA's office, to the law enforcement community, to the community in general. The idea of team is something that is very important to me and something I really try to foster here. And so we do work together very closely here. However, there's sort of this natural tension, the way it's built, with the DA's office having some amount of oversight. We communicate together. There will be cases where, we may need to instruct a bit, or, we have a difficult problem to resolve together, with victims' input and law enforcement. So I always try to foster that team together communication, and that's very important. But the community's idea, and I think we're talking about this more now than ever, appropriately, is the question about what is policing and how does law enforcement work in a community, or justice work in a community. It's really up to the community, right? So we're having better conversations now than unfortunately we've had previously. We're learning a lot about what the priorities are of our community rather than what we think they are. This machine that we work in called criminal justice has been going a long time, and people come and go and fill the roles of DA or police officer, or judge, defense attorney, and but the machine, that system, as we call it, has been around, and so it's appropriate right now to take some time and to look around and inspect this machine and see what needs fixed potentially, and we need the community's input on that.
Thank you. Kelley, as a former prosecutor, was there anything that you sort of wanted to add to these answers about the way, from your experiences, that you've seen the role of police in various communities, and I guess specifically Philadelphia?
Yes, Teri, thank you very much. And prior to responding to the question, I do want to thank the PBA for continuing this dialogue through a series, not just a one event discussion, but acknowledging that it takes a lot of breadth and depth of conversations to really address all the complexities that we are discussing here today. And I'm really honored to be with all the other members of the panel and feel truly complimented to be alongside them in this virtual setting to discuss this. Police, what is policing? What are police? What was my first kind of gut reaction in hearing the term and kind of taking it from a noun to a verb? I see police and policing, I equate it with safety and safety for citizens in the community. That's what I teach my son, who's 12, to understand and acknowledge about the police. That's what I would expect or hope that citizens and how they view police, regardless of their social economic status or their ethnic makeup. So that is in the ideal world, what I would expect of police to be is a person or an individual or an entity that's going to ensure safety for our community. And for all citizens, regardless of who they are, where they come from. I will add my perspective in doing the work that I've done over the course of my career is not only from being a prosecutor for about 9-10 years of my career, but also from being a public defender in Virginia first. So I had the relationship on the other side of the aisle with police, and it was a relationship that I had, and I still had the same expectation. But my, doe-eyed utopia at age 24 when I became a public defender was markedly different than when I was in my mid-40s and returned to Philadelphia and served as the district attorney. But all of that did not change the way that I view police and policing, which is to ensure safety for citizens. And that's my expectation.
Thanks, Kelley. And Riley, I want to turn to you for 1 second, because I think that a term that we hear a lot of is defunding the police. And I'm wondering if you can briefly sort of tie that and contextualize this with how it works with the role of police more generally.
Yeah, so and let me as well, just as all my other panel members said, thank you to the PBA for this important conversation, for continuing this dialogue, because this is not a problem that's going to be addressed in one setting, and there are many different causes and many different ways that we need to address it and attack it if we are going to rid ourselves of the problem of racism in this country, and the many facets and the many distinct places that it touches. But as far as the question goes, you know, the defunding the police and the role, I'll kind of take it in reverse order and first go back to the first question, which actually will hopefully kind of weave into that. But the role that police play, I think it depends. I think it depends on who you're asking. I think that the role that the police play is very different from people who've had contact with police or who have family members or friends that have had contact with police, and people who don't have or haven't had many contacts with police. But I think overall, the overall feeling for those who've had contact with police is that they are there to maintain law and order. They're there to control situations, to make sure that things don't get out of hand. And a derivative of that is safety. But it's not always just about safety as much as it is about controlling a situation. And as I say that, I don't even know if I think everyone can relate. Anyone who's ever had who's ever been driving on the highway and had a police officer get behind them, or past a police officer that may have been sitting there with the radar gun checking speed, your mood changes, your behavior changes, especially if a police officer is driving behind you. You may not be doing anything wrong, but all of a sudden you're really worried that you don't do something wrong, because your belief that they're there to maintain order, and you want to make sure that you don't commit any violations to do that. And so I think that you know, as far as what police do, I think that's what comes to mind for a lot of people, that they're there to maintain order. For sure, we want them there for safety as well. If something does go wrong, we want to be able to call the police and have them come to aid us. That being said, I think that the police today are called for far too many reasons and to handle and to address far too many situations, and that often leads to negative outcomes. So when you talk about defunding the police, as I understand it and as I advocate for it, first of all, I think personally it's a horrible term, because it doesn't really speak to what the actual goal is for that. It is not to take money away from police completely, to do away with police, but it is it is an awareness or a belief that police wear too many hats, and also have budgets that are too large and don't is not necessary for the role that we want them to play. And so defunding the police really means taking away money and duties for the police that they don't need to handle. For instance, handling mental health calls. Police officers may not be equipped, or most police officers are not equipped to handle mental health crises. They're not trained in that area with the sufficient amount of training that's needed to address mental health crisis, or someone that's in a mental health crisis at the time. The funding may address, you know, how much money is going into militaristic equipment for police officers that a certain police department may not need. Armored vehicles or tactical weapons that you wouldn't associate with police that are there to serve and to protect the community. Money taken from the police to be diverted to other places is what people are talking about when they talk about defunding the police. Taking away resources and putting them in another area, and then also taking away some of the duties that the police have, because I do believe that we put too much and ask them to wear too many hats in too many different situations.
Thank you, Riley. And I think you're exactly right that police have an enormous amount asked of them. And I think part of that actually depends on where police are and what community that they're serving. So, I think that we often talk about police in a generalized way, but the fact of the matter is that police differ, they police geographical areas, and the way in which police, to be almost redundant, varies depending on the community that they're in. So one of the things that I mentioned in my opening remarks was the fact that Blacks and whites tend to view the role of police differently. And I guess what I would sort of to put out to the whole panel, and I'll start with you, Riley, since I just ended with you, and that is, are Blacks and whites policed differently? And if so, how so?
Well, I would say that yes, in general, but obviously there are, we can dive a little deeper and just on from that surface level. I think that communities are policed differently, and the communities that are low income, communities that are inner city, they're policed differently than suburban communities. And so when you look at the makeup of those different communities, then that's when you can maybe start talking about differences in race, when we're talking about from a generalized position. But I think that when we talk about the policing, and I know, and from talking to Kelley, that she uses this example as well. But this is the example that I use when I talk about systematic problems with policing, when I talk about systematic racism and how these things basically survived generations and generations of attacks of trying to dismantle these problems. When you look at, for instance, drugs, and in the federal system, overwhelmingly the people who are incarcerated there are the majority of the people incarcerated there are for drug crimes. When we talk about mass incarceration, we're talking about drug crimes. The source for these people usually coming from drug crimes that are happening in hand-to-hand transactions that are being set up in inner city neighborhoods. Police may set up a poll camera, monitor hand-to-hand transactions over a course of time, round people up, arrest them, charge conspiracy counts, expand the scope of people involved, connect them together. They go to jail for some significant amount of time. Well, the focus of that community, and people will say that there are people in that community that don't want people selling drugs on their corner. That's true. That don't want violence associated with the drug selling to happen. That's true. They don't want the nuisances that are associated with drug users leaving vials or needles on the street. That is all true for sure. And the focus is there. However, when you're talking about the leap that some people may take, is that the police are there because that's where the crime is, but that's just where a decision is being made, that's where we're going to police. If the police were to set up on any college campus, they would likely find just as many drug transactions that are occurring on a college campus as are occurring in that inner city community. If they were to set up in a city, in a hot spot where a lot of nightclubs gather, a lot of cities now, they have nightclubs built up around a couple of city blocks. If they were to set up shop there, they would find just as many hand-to-hand transactions on any Friday and Saturday night as they would in those neighborhoods. And so it's not that that's where the crime is happening to the exclusion of other places. That's where the policing is occurring. And that is why those people that are there are being locked up. And then we extract that and look at mass incarceration, who's being locked up. It's not because black and brown people are committing more drug crimes than others. It's because that's where the policing is occurring.
Thanks, Riley. And I want Corporal Greene, I want to come back to you for a second, because one of the things that you mentioned as serving in the Heritage Affairs and serving in that position is that you are working with underserved communities. And I guess I'm sort of curious if you could take a moment to talk to us a little bit about how you all are defining underserved communities and what it looks like as you build relationships with them.
So it's a couple different ways that we'll do that. We have what we call community service officers, which are typically at every station throughout the state. So the community service officers, they are very connected within their community, and they know most of the church leaders, community leaders, and people like that within their community. Also, our recruitment office, they're very familiar with certain areas on how the dynamic is set up and we communicate with
Is anybody else having trouble hearing Corporal Greene? Okay.
Funny.
I don't know if somebody can mute him momentarily, and we're going to come back to him maybe when his Wi-Fi picks up.
Terry, I'll say that it may help to, for whoever's controlling the Zoom, if they turn off his camera, that may help
young
the audio
kids, they never seen a state trooper.
Oh,
better.
okay.
And
Well,
that's
he's
where
back.
we want to bridge that gap, and we want to build that relationship. So they know who we are. That's how we.
Okay. Thank you for what we kind of heard, Corporal Greene. Just so you know, you're breaking up a little bit, and it may help if you turn off your camera and just go to straight audio, which sometimes requires less of your internet connection. So I guess I wanted to come back to Kelley and Matt with this same sort of question, because as prosecutors, you're handed, or you take on a lot of cases. And I guess what my question would be is that, based on your experiences, do you think that Blacks and whites, are just based upon race, that the way in which people are policed varies?
Matt, you want to take it?
Go ahead.
My short answer is going to be yes. My long-winded supplement to my short answer of yes is similar to what Riley has already stated regarding digging more deeper into the communities and the makeup of the communities, and where police are directed to conduct their policing, whether it be for narcotics surveillance, whether it be for high incidents of gun violence. There are various, when I was in Philadelphia and in my office as a line DA and then returning as DA, there are various programs and things in place working alongside with the police department and the DA's office to address these kind of targeted efforts. And oftentimes the efforts were based on obviously a problem, and the problem tended to be in communities of color. And so, I think you have that component, but you also have the individual actions of police officers and their decision making and what they bring to the table inherently as individuals, their implicit biases, so forth and so on, in how they go ahead and execute the job of policing. And if they have adopted the thought process that in certain neighborhoods we're going to have higher incidents of drugs, we're going to have higher incidents of guns. That is something that cannot be lost and cannot be overlooked. It's part of the reason we're in the problem, or have the problem that we have. It's part of the reason why we're having this conversation, and the legislature at the state and federal level are discussing all of the reforms. It's trying to undo those components that have been woven into the system, that inherently have made the system, people don't trust it. And particularly people of color don't trust it because they don't feel like they're going to get a fair shake in it. And I think that goes to the no snitching mentality, people, feeling like they can't cooperate or don't want to cooperate with the police, even when it involves a crime in their own community, because they just don't feel like they will be adequately protected. And I do echo what Riley said about college campuses. I will also say, you go to a Grateful Dead concert, what may be going on in the parking lot. Now, I've never been to one, but you know, that I've been, you know, if you look for it, you shall find it. If you, you know, suspect that certain environments are going to have it, be it a college campus, you know, a dorm, a concert, you know, you look and you shall find. And I think that it's not lost on anyone to know that police are assigned and given tasks in light of what they expect that they are going to find in order to go ahead and address criminal behavior. But sometimes there is no criminal behavior, and the police are called upon. And I mentioned this before, the Amy Cooper situation, which that video was released the same day as the George Floyd. And so you have that man in the park watching birds and being called on by a white female who says, well, I'm going to call the police on you, black man watching birds, because I don't believe that, I believe you're threatening me, and that's what I'm going to say. I'm fearful of you. So we have a lot of things here that goes to what Riley said a moment ago about, you know, what are the police being called upon to do? And is it really criminal that they're being asked to act upon? Or is it just societally what we have adopted as this is what we believe the police should respond to and get control of, so to speak. So I'll stop there, and Matt, you can take it from there.
Well, I think everyone has answered has answered very well so far. If I could just add something, I guess Teri mentioned the letter I sent out in June, and you know, as I witnessed what everyone else witnessed in this environment that we've been in 2020, I wanted to challenge my community here, and I'm in South Central Pennsylvania, a little bit different than Philadelphia, and I wanted to challenge the community, the law enforcement community in general, to embrace this moment and the momentum that we have right now, and the rightness of it as I feel it and see it. The older I get, the more perspective is an important word to me. When I give trainings to police officers, I have a slide that just has the word perspective on it. And I hope it sort of goes to the question. Law enforcement needs to be open-minded right now. There's an inclination, I think, to be defensive anytime there's criticism or you know, a request for introspection. I think there's obvious to me, there's a natural defensiveness. I think law enforcement has to lean into this discussion, and part of my letter was a passionate request as the chief law enforcement officer for the rest of law enforcement behind me to get into this conversation. We have to. And when I talk about perspective here in the community, I'll give you a really quick example. I have a family member who was driving one night on an interstate, and another vehicle was going very, very fast in and out of traffic through a windy portion of interstate, ended up wrecking. And so this relative of mine stopped to be a witness, to do some civic duty, and, you know, give a statement to the police. And the person ended up being charged with reckless driving, something like that, recklessly endangering another person. It's a Maryland case. I saw this family member later and asked, you know, what's going on with the case. And he had been requested to go to a preliminary hearing. It was continued. He complained about that. I'm used to hearing that. And some months later, I asked him about it. We were at a Fuddruckers, and I happened to ask him, hey, whatever happened with that case where you were a witness? And he said, I don't really know. I don't remember hearing anything lately. It's probably a plea bargain, some plea deal. And so I said, well, let me just ask you, what do you think should happen in that case? Not being a lawyer, as a citizen, what do you think ought to happen to that driver? Not knowing sentencing guideline ranges and anything like that. And he said he should go to jail for the rest of his life. And I didn't make that face that Teri's making. I did it inside, and we're in a respectable Fuddruckers, so I'm not going to cause a scene. And I said, but no, really, what do you think should happen? He said he should go to jail the rest of his life. He could have killed me, my family members, other drivers. And So just let it at that. How about those Steelers? Change the subject. He was getting passionate about it. What's interesting is that this is a family member, and we share a family member who's been in and out of some trouble. And so unfortunately passed away. It was our first fentanyl overdose here in my county 4 years ago. And he had some scrapes with the law, some DUIs, some thefts, stole from some people. And every time that happened, it was different. What they need to understand about him is this or that experience and trauma in his life, which is true. But while that driver needed to go to jail the rest of his life, the driver he didn't know anything about, the family member who made some bad decisions clearly was a little different, and we need to be circumspect in how we think about what happens in the case. So I don't know, the older I get, hopefully I get a little bit wiser, and I sort of pay attention to things like that and try to be as instructive or helpful to my community and law enforcement in general, and talking about things like that and sort of relating experiences that I think a lot of us have that are similar.
Matt, thank you for sharing that story. I think that it really helps put things in perspective of how we police and what policing should look like and what the criminal justice more broadly should look like. I want to be aware of the time and make sure that if we have questions from the audience that we have time to take a few of those. But I guess what I want to sort of ask each of you, because we are at a point, as I said, where I think that we are really reimagining our future of this country. And with policing and with race relations, so much has come to a head in this past year. So, I guess I will this is a sort of multiple part question, which is, if you're imagining the future, what do you want it to look like when it comes to policing? And specifically, if there was one police reform measure that you could implement, what would it be? And I'll start off with you, Matt.
At our local state police station, we have what's called a crime room, which has detectives in it. And then we have a patrol room, which has, patrol troopers who wear the gray uniform, and you see them on the highways, and that's what, gets your heart rate going when you see them in the rear view, all of us. So the crime room, the detectives are plainclothes. They handle the serious cases, the cases that I deal with. So I deal with these detectives more often than homicides and serious cases. The percentage is about 80% patrol and 20% detectives. And if I were a chief of police or running a station like that, I would flip it. I think just personally, the priorities, in my view, of the community, what the protection is, what the safety is, are those classes of offenses. So it's just allocation, I think, of priority, I think, is what my answer would be.
Corporal Greene, what about you? And I'm hoping we can have you on audio now. If not, I might give you a sign like a timeout or something, and we'll circle back to you again if it's not working.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, it's not doing the video right now. So I guess the answer to that question, there's a lot of moving parts to that. I don't think there's one single answer to say this is what police need to be in order for it to work. I think it's going to vary from community to community. And it's like what I said before, you have to be able to be connected to your community and know what your community needs are. We need to have a uniform presence just because there's no statistic to tell how many times that you may have deterred a crime of happening, because they may see the cop car, the cop could be doing paperwork or driving down the street, and that may deter a crime, but we never know that because there's no statistic to show that. Also, I think it's very good for community relations, because if you're driving down the road, you're on patrol and you see neighborhood kids or even people in the community, you engage in those conversations. I think it goes a long way when they see that a person in uniform, being able to talk to them like they're human beings. And I think that that would help. But I think what you need to do as a police department, you have to be able to be diverse and represent your community, so you're able to establish a good working relationship and rapport with each other.
Kelley, what about you?
I have two things, not just one, that I feel are kind of at the top of my list of things to look to for some step in the right direction towards kind of changing things in this system. One is accountability. I have heard and seen, and I know it's not popular, but we know there are barriers to what I would say are responses that police commissioners want to take regarding the actions of their officers within their department. Understanding, you know, collective bargaining agreements, understanding union rights, understanding all of the various complexities that go into this particular conversation. But I do believe that there needs to be a greater level of authority without compromising due process to really go ahead and have some succinct accountability that rests within the individuals that are tasked with leading the department. They are tasked with leading the ship, and if they lead it improperly or incorrectly, then they are no longer in those positions. But presuming that they have all the authority and ability and intelligence and trustworthiness to lead, then I think that they need to be able to be trusted when decisions need to be made after appropriate review on what needs to happen regarding a problematic officer or officers. The lack of accountability inherently creates the distrust within the community. And I also feel, and I've done a little kind of loose research on this on my own, because I gave remarks to the state Senate in June and researched this information then. The maturity of officers and when they are able to become police or peace officers across the country. I pulled, in preparation for this today, information regarding Pennsylvania, New York, Florida, and California. It varies in each jurisdiction, but for the long and short of it, you could be as young as 18, 19 years of age, up to at least age 21 in order to go ahead and become a police officer. And when you think about the responsibilities of an officer to say you are able to have a badge, have a gun, and therefore secure the community and respond to critical situations. And then I will ask everyone in this room virtually to think about adolescent brain development and what we know about the development of the human brain and when and how they assess risk and are able to problem solve and they're able to predict outcomes. And now we know that police have to do it in a split second. And does that all match up? And when we're talking about individuals they're responding to that do have, we know they're in acute situations. They may or may not have mental health concerns, which just can aggravate the acute situation in terms of how to appropriately respond. I had clients such as these. I've had victims such as these. Is it fair to not only the community, but to the officer to put them in these positions when they are not equipped with the maturity to handle the job at 19 years of age? So that's another thought. So those are the two things. And I will also say this at the end. We've heard a great deal and we've spoken a great deal about community. And I looked up that definition too, to just know kind of really what it is. And while there are many variations depending on Webster's dictionary or whatever, it says it's a feeling of fellowship with others as a result of sharing common attitudes, interests, and goals. And so that's what, in my opinion, really needs to be worked on in order to make any of this have a viable opportunity to thrive and to grow and to really take root as a systemic change. And I say that now because I don't know if we'll have the chance to circle back around again with questions coming up, but I really did want to put forth a definition of community, since we know that all of this that we're discussing in terms of race and racism and policing, can you relate to me? Can you look at me? Do you see me as you? Do you see me as your son or daughter? Do you see my son as your son if we are of different ethnicities? Those are the questions that I had that I want to believe are a yes, And I know many officers absolutely is a yes, but it's evident by the videos that we've seen. That was a depraved officer who had his knee on the neck of George Floyd. I've never seen such a level of depravity, and I've seen some very bad videos and some very bad crime scenes over my years of practice. That video was probably the most gut-wrenching video I've watched in my career. And it just showed to me, just a devoid of feeling. And that's a really scary thing. So.
Thank you, Kelley. Riley, what would you do moving forward? What reform measure would you propose or implement?
Well,
Had you
I mean, there would be a lot of them, but I'm going to try to limit them to, I mean, there would be a lot, but I'm going to try to limit them to, just for the sake of time. Like Kelley, I think that accountability is the biggest thing given the state of police relations now. And I think one way we achieve accountability is through transparency. We've got to know, we've got to be able to have the information of who's committing violations, who's committing police brutality. Studies have been done, and Teri, I think you've done one of them that shows that, in police departments, there are a small number of people that are creating violations and violations and violations. The same small number of officers are repeatedly violating, committing police brutality. They're costing taxpayers millions and millions of dollars, and commissioners and mayors and citizens, they can't get rid of them. And one of the big problems with that is the police unions, which some people kind of address too, their problem in this as well. But the transparency and being able to bring that information out in the open, how many complaints this officer has against him or her, the lack of discipline that is the result of these complaints, the fact that the person staying on the job, how much money they're making, all those things will I think go a long way of getting the accountability that is needed. We police officers, we give them, there's no other occupation where we give them the power to take lives, to take a person's freedom. We talk about on the far end of killing someone. Obviously, that's the far end. But what about just placing someone in handcuffs, restricting their ability to move, restricting their freedom? We give police officers that power, and I think we should hold them to a higher standard. And that means that if we're going to do that, then let's be more selective about who can do that. And to be more selective, let's pay them more. I mean, you have people talk about, the dangers of their job, the importance of their job, the civic duty that they serve. Well, let's pay them in that way. And therefore, we can be more selective as to who we hire as police officers, who have as Kelley was talking about, the ability to differentiate between good situations and bad situations, and to be able to determine what amount of force is necessary, when it's time to de-escalate, when it's time to use force, and you're only using the force that's necessary in that situation. So I would say accountability gets at that point, and I think that in doing that, we've got to also just kind of get out of the mindset that challenging those who commit police brutality is being anti-police. I don't think police officers want to serve with people who would blatantly violate the rights of others. But we also have to give them the ability to speak out against it and not fear retribution, not fear that their officer is not going to have their back if they were to speak out, not fear that they're going to be censored when they say something like Black Lives Matter. We've got to get out of that mindset that it's us versus them, and that's a mindset that we're sending police officers with, starting with training, where there's this warrior police mentality that's being taught, so that it's an us versus them thing. It can't be the fact that protesting and speaking out against police brutality means that you're anti-police, and we've got to get out of that if we're gonna change anything.
Now, as we sort of wrap up our conversation, there are a couple of words that have really echoed throughout. And one of them, I think, is who we are as a community and how we understand that community. And Kelley gave us a really great viewpoint and lens from which to view that. but also how we view one another as individuals, which is really part and parcel to our ideas communities. And each of you have assumed a leadership position in our community and in these discussions regarding police and police reform and really changing the way that our country looks. And I thank you for taking those leadership roles. But I guess what I also want to turn to, and it's funny because I have been sort of watching the chat, and Jana Barnett actually posed my last question for me, which is, you guys have assumed these leadership positions, but what can just we as individuals do to start achieving these changes that we've talked about, to start having police take on more of a guardian attitude, that we start to identify with one another more, and we start to achieve the reform that, as I mentioned at the beginning, many of us have come to believe is long overdue and is necessary. Matt, why don't I start with you?
No, I need another minute or two. Let somebody else get first.
Corporal Greene, what do you think? What can individuals do to help in this endeavor that everybody who has taken the time out of their day to be here clearly has a vested interest in?
I think as the community, what they can do is reach out to their local police department. Ask to speak to the police chief, or if it's a Pennsylvania State Police Station, the station commander, which is usually a lieutenant or a sergeant, and sit down with them and say, hey, as a community, we would like to start working with you so we could help each other out. I think that's the number one step, or the first step that should be taken, and I think that you would get some success with that, because once again, we do have community service people in place, troopers, that do handle that. We field phone calls about that all the time, and they do set up events and they set up working groups. Myself, with several different counties within the southeast part of the state that I'm currently working with, that has either DAs, police chiefs, and community leaders and people from the community, where we're working together to try to make policing better for the future. So that's why I say that's the first step, because I see it is working. It's going to be work in progress. It's going to be a while, but it is working in a positive direction.
Teri, if I could, on the heels of what Corporal Greene just said, I'm going to take it a step further and suggest to Corporal Greene and to all law enforcement in the Commonwealth, meet them where they are, meet the community where they are. While they can call upon you, presumably the communities that are having the greatest difficulty and don't, in essence, maybe have the level of trust in you, are not going to call because of that inherent distrust. So go to them, call them, call your leaders in, religious organizations who have their finger on the pulse of the community. When I was DA for a brief period of time, in terms of I was finishing out the term of my predecessor, and I knew I had a finite time. And I set up 5 meetings with all religious faiths, based upon the districts and how Philadelphia is divided. And I did so with the purpose of wanting to hear from them, what is it that you need from the district attorney's office to improve our ability to really help the community? And I sent out a letter. I sent it out to the various leaders of churches in the city, of all faiths and backgrounds, synagogues, mosques, and had these kind of sessions and listening sessions, and took colleagues from my office. And that, for me, was an ability for everyone in my office to hear what we needed to hear in order to improve our jobs and our roles as district attorneys, going in and arguing cases and asking for somebody's liberty to be taken away, or to ensure that people in the community are safe. So I would say go to them is my response. I think that a lot is put on the community to come and reach out, and right now they're not trusting. And so you need to meet them where they are in whatever way is comfortable for them, to kind of melt away and take away that level of distrust and that barrier that we know does exist because people are seeing what they have seen and observed in these videos, which are not indicative of the profession as a whole. But unfortunately, they just overshadow all the good work that is being done by police every single day.
And to answer that, I can't speak for all law enforcement, but for the areas that I do work, we do that already. We already going into the communities, and we also reach out not only to the townships and cities and boroughs that we serve. We go to those meetings as well, so we could even engage with the community there. We do have programs like Camp Cadet that's set up. For example, Camp Cadet, I was one of the founding people for that for the city of Philadelphia when we did that in 2017. So that was our way in getting out into the community. It was very successful. So a lot of those things that you did say, for the areas that, for the state police that we work for, we are already doing that, and we're continuing to do that. And that's why we're building on to this Heritage Affairs section, along with our community service, so we can keep on building upon that.
Thank you for your work, Greene. Riley.
I would say that the things that people can do is to demand transparency, especially when it comes to the collective bargaining for police unions, because I think that that is the biggest wall in the way of getting rid of officers who brutalize citizens. You know, we have Act Bill 111. Next year, there's going to, at least in Philadelphia, there's going to be a discussion about a new contract over collective bargaining, and people go and demand to see the terms that are being put forth there, because you know, right now the police union can come in and with binding arbitration appeal any decisions by the police department to fire someone or to discipline someone and get those overturned through binding arbitration. And that's what keeps bad officers on the street. And you can do all the, you know, community meetings and the sessions and have officers that have talked to the community, but if those bad officers are still there, that totally undermines any trust that can build up. It actually prevents the trust from being built up. You can go and ask any kid on the street or any adult, and they know who the bad officers are. They can tell you like that particular, and I know this because, you know, when my clients come to talk to me about it, they may not have had a specific run-in with a particular officer, but they can tell me who has, and they can tell me, you know, who the bad officers are. And as long as those officers are on the street, then that distrust gets imputed to the rest of the officers. Why? Because in their eyes, truthfully and rightfully so, those other officers are allowing that person to stay there and to stay in that uniform and to continue to brutalize citizens. And so until that is dealt with, until officers who commit police brutality until they are taking off the force, then it's really going to be hard to build up any trust amongst any community. You know, if that were to happen and you take that same situation and put it in any community, it's going to be really hard to build up trust within the community so long as officers have been seen to have brutalized individuals and then return to the job the next day without any punishment and without being removed from that position. So I would say go out there and demand transparency, demand that the barriers that are put in place that prevent these officers from being fired, that those barriers are removed. And I think that those barriers are biggest in the police union, and that's where work needs to be done.
Matt.
Yeah, thanks for the time. Yeah, I think all of those are right. And, you know, I'll sort of double down on all of that and say that, you know, Kelley mentioned the faith community, and there's a phrase in my head lately, are you washed in the blood or just in the water? And that's what sort of compelled me to say what I said recently and continue to say. These times are extraordinary, I think, and the way we fail to connect, the way we treat each other, the closed-mindedness right now, it's very difficult. I'm very hopeful. Otherwise, I don't get up in the morning. So I think we can come out of all of this better. But I would say demand, like Riley said, demand leaders that are authentic, I guess, and that don't just take talking points, but to actually connect. You know, humanity is an important thing. It's all we got. Going back to Kelley's definition of community, really. I used the word machine earlier, and That's not what we do. This isn't a machine that's good for building cars, not for dealing with liberty and human lives. So connection and demanding leadership. That's my answer.
Thank you, Matt. So momentarily we'll open it up to questions, and I see there's been some really great ones already posed. And I guess I'll sort of close out with this statement, Matt, which actually comes full circle to what your sign in your office is, which is one team, one fight. And I think that, you know, what I have really taken from this conversation is that we all really need to work on how we define our team, and that it needs to be far more inclusive, far broader, that we need to look at each other with respect, with love, with understanding, and that, you know, we need to fight this fight together. And I think that when we approach it as such, when we stop sort of seeing our differences and start seeing our common humanity and our shared goals, we're really going to start to see some real reform. And I, like you, Matt, am very optimistic, and I'm very grateful. I'm grateful for the work that each of you have done. I'm grateful for you all each putting yourselves out there and leading us all in how we move forward. And I'm grateful for our audience for taking the time out of their day when it is a beautiful day to spend some time listening and learning and thinking about how we can make this a better place for all of us, because we are a community. We have come together and we will move forward together. So thank you all. And I do want to open it up for questions now. And it's my understanding I'm not actually sort of charged with questions per se, but perhaps we can start taking some questions from the audience. And yeah, you guys can answer them.
And before we get to questions, could I just say one thing? Because I know I may not be able to say it at the end, if you don't
Please,
mind,
Kelley.
Teri.
Sure.
As a former DA to another DA, I have to say that I applaud what you did, Matt. In June, you did it based upon your heart, based upon your conscience. It took conviction to be a leader and to put yourself in the position that you weren't necessarily expecting the response that you got, and you know, I'd hoped or wished that would not have been the response, but you got it, and to that, it did not change and should not change and has not changed your commitment to doing what's right every single day. And so for what you have done, for not just as an individual human being, but for the office that you represent and the citizens that you represent, not just in Franklin County, but across the Commonwealth, I have to applaud you for taking that step and to make such a strong and clear and unequivocal statement on behalf of the value of human life, period. It's really something that needs to be said. And so I say it to you as a former prosecutor, always will be a prosecutor to some extent in my heart, and knowing the difficulty that can come with your job and your role in making decisions every day. May not be popular, but doing the right thing is not necessarily popular. And you did exactly what you felt should have been done. And so I can't say enough thank you.
Thank you, everybody. This is Jennifer Ellis. I am going to help moderate the questions now. You may continue to type questions. The program will continue while you people are willing to stay around and ask questions and answer them. So it is 5:15, but I will leave it to you to decide when this program ends. I'm just going to take the questions in order. Andrea asks, I've heard the term community policing a lot. Can you describe what it is, and also the Camden, New Jersey community policing model in particular? Who would answer that? Or at least community policing.
Is Corporal Greene still with us? I think that, you know, it sounds as if a lot of what he is doing is community policing or something very akin to it. So perhaps he's the sort of resident expert on that.
Yeah, I'm here. As far as the community policing, you have to be engaged with the community. You have to know what the community's concerns are. And we have to be able to listen to the community to see what their concerns are. And then as law enforcement, we have to be able to also educate the community at the same token, at the same time, because there's times where the community thinks that we should be doing one thing, but legally we can't do that. And I think that's where, if we're communicating with each other, we could both come to a common ground. And because there's some things that they're just unrealistic for whatever it may be. But I'm a strong believer in that you have to have programs in place, which that's what we are doing. And we're looking to build upon those programs and even come up with different models where we're out there each and every day, from the patrol units to our special units, the community service officers, the recruitment, the heritage affairs. Those are the things that I say that are community policing. We have to be there to be a guardian for the community and be able to serve and protect them at all times.
Andrea, I just shared a link from the Department of Justice. It is their definition of community policing. It's actually a 16-page document that contains quite a bit of information about what they consider to be community policing. So hopefully you'll find that useful. Moving on.
You know, let me say on that note, Jennifer, that one thing that is we have to be careful of is that, you know, and perhaps what the corporal was thinking of was more about community engagement, because a lot of times when we talk about community policing, that I believe started with the kind of the broken windows theory, and that we're going to address, if we address everything from a police standpoint in the community, we can raise the community. And what we saw happen out of that theory was really just more contacts with the police and with the community, which meant more arrests. And I don't think that that's what we want when we're, and what we have in mind. So perhaps the phrasing of it needs to be changed to more community engagement, because, you know, and what we haven't really talked about a lot here is the underlying thing, which I know that this series about is about with regards to racism. And, you know, I know someone in the chat talked about having body cameras, and I think that's a great idea, but we've seen time and time again that even when it is playing on camera and caught on camera, different people have different interpretations and have different beliefs as to how that citizen should have reacted or should have been treated. And a lot of that is rooted in racism. And so when you're talking about community policing, a lot of times, unfortunately, racism comes into play, and there's a belief that in certain communities need to be policed a certain way as opposed to other communities, and that there's more of a need to get in there and have a more law and order approach rather than an engagement approach. And I think that all of those things need to be taken into account, and we need to be really careful when we're talking about encouraging police and citizen contacts, because the underlying thing could result, instead of engagement and more trust, instead leads to more arrests and more people coming in contact with the criminal justice system.
I think those are critical points. And I will read the initial definition. Community policing comprises 3 key components: community partnerships, collaborative partnerships between the law enforcement agency and the individuals and organizations they serve to develop solutions to problems and increase trust in police. Organizational transformation, the alignment of organizational management structure, personnel, and information systems to support community partnerships and proactive problem solving. The process of engaging in the proactive and systemic examination of identified problems to develop and evaluate effective responses. Quite different from the broken windows view of policing, which I do believe, if I may say, is a fundamental issue because of the difference in treatment. When you see a Black kid on the street or a white kid on the street, and you see a broken window, are the police just going to go automatically assume it was a Black kid? And of course, what does the broken windows form of policing mean? I agree with you. How we define these terms is so critical, but the way it's defined in this document, which I just found, seems to be, Riley, in concert with what you're talking about and what Corporal Greene was talking about as well. So
yeah, and I would just add to this too, that I think that one of the things that's interesting about sort of the pivot from broken windows to community policing is that the broken windows theory is very much that small nuisances become big problems. And so there was actually the way the phrase came out is they did a test and they placed a car in a neighborhood, and the car, like, once it became vandalized, started becoming vandalized by everybody. And they started to see sort of crime rise around this car. But then the idea that once the neighborhood wasn't cared for, that it invited more crime. So the idea is that one small crime is an invitation for bigger crimes. And so the way that you engage in crime prevention, and this is a very old theory, I mean, well, not very old, but from sort of the 70s, but that you can prevent and deter crime by stopping the small nuisances. So by stopping people from drinking beer on the street or, playing music too loud, and that it had this larger effect on the community because more people would feel safer. And that one of the things that was interesting about it is that it did not, what later studies showed was that it didn't necessarily result in less crime, but it made people feel safer. And some of the questions or problems with this, as Riley has pointed out, is that part of these issues came up with more police being in patrol cars as opposed to sort of walking a beat. But as police sort of started to engage with the community more, some of the things that Broken Windows talked specifically about was how police policed, and that it could take on sort of more casual affairs. So they could sort of decide with the neighborhood that they were okay with people drinking as long as they had it in brown bags. And it started to be this idea of what the neighborhood wanted it to look like. But then, of course, this starts to raise questions about who gets invited to the conversation. And they talked specifically in Broken Windows about treating insiders and outsiders differently. And when you start thinking about it in that way, it starts to also invite these ideas of who's a community member and who's not, who belongs and who doesn't belong. And so while, community engagement, as I think Riley and Corporal Greene have talked about, is a really important concept and one that I think most of us would agree with. There really is this question about what community engagement means and what it looks like.
And Teri, I'll piggyback on that. It really goes into how do you view your community? And while we didn't talk a great deal, like heavily on the race issue in this discussion today, we wove it in throughout in touch points. Again, I reiterate, Amy Cooper felt she needed to call the police on the other Mr. Cooper who was in the park watching birds, because she felt she would get a certain reaction because he was Black. And that's what we're talking about here. That's what we have to address is why do people feel comfortable calling the police for something like that, or the Starbucks situation here in Philadelphia? Why are those things happening? And then the police, how should they respond? I think that we really need to dig deep into those specific issues to really make that kind of societal shift as to what will or will not be tolerated as a social norm for us as a country, as a people. What are we, because we constructed policing, we constructed incarceration, we constructed these things in our laws in order to go ahead and ensure people have, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But we also know that we weren't contemplated in that, meaning Black people. And so, let's get to kind of the nitty gritty here. And I think it requires a great deal of introspection and a great deal of thoughtfulness, and kind of saying, am I going to be complicit in what's going on and say nothing? Or am I going to be an ally and vocal and use my abilities to change things, as Matt has done, and to go ahead and to put things, to take those steps to move things in a different direction, because we don't like the direction we've been going in for a number of years. And this is like turning the Titanic of sorts, and you're not going to turn it overnight. It's going to take a lot of people to go ahead and turn this ship around if we are going to be fully committed. But I have used like the Juan Quiñones videos of what would you do? And there's a what would you do from 10 years ago of people trying to steal a bike in a park, and they have a Black young man, a white young man, and a Caucasian female. And it's interesting to see the people who react in the park to how quickly they react to the young Black man, you know, looking to jimmy the bike off of the lock. And then you fast forward and they just did it again a matter of months ago in Portland, Oregon. Same scenario, 10 years have transpired, same response. Why? Why is that? And so I think, you know, those are the things that you need to ask, regardless of where you are, your profession. We fortunately are seekers of justice and the right thing. We went to law to do those things. So we actually have the ability to make that change. And hopefully we will listen with open ears to everyone who has a concern and understand and validate that concern, regardless of whether or not you witnessed it or didn't witness it. Validate the story they're telling you in their narrative, and then see what you can do to go ahead and help.
Mhm.
I would recommend that Harvard has an implicit bias test. I took it years ago, and I took it again recently, and I had changed. I know that I have implicit biases. We all do. It's impossible not to have them. So if you want to look up that test and give it a try, you might find it interesting. It has tests on everything you can possibly imagine. Now, I don't know how accurate they are, but I do know it made me think. And I think right now, thinking and being willing to ask the hard questions of ourselves about our own biases and how they impact how we behave in the world around us, and whether we are Ms. Cooper who's calling the police, or Mr. Cooper who's the victim. You know, why would we do that, and would we have done the same thing? Matt.
Jennifer, I will add to this really quickly, just a very short sort of personal story that I think is so telling. But when I started off these initial comments and I started talking about the criminal justice system, I think that it's important that we all take ownership in it. And when we call 911, like that is often the start of a criminal justice system. It's not always, but it is in a lot of cases. And so thinking about that decision, and this story is meant to be, you know, lighthearted in the sense of, my mother lives in a really nice condo that's pretty fancy, and it has some diverse people in it, but it's an, you know, upper class condo, and so it's primarily white, even though it's in Philadelphia. But this past spring, somebody was able to get into the door of the condo and basically like rob them like of all of their Amazon packages that were sitting out in the hallway and a few bicycles, and they left through the courtyard. And this is 2 o'clock in the morning. And as they're leaving in the courtyard, they watch the video later on and they see the person actually being stopped by a neighbor, and the neighbor chats with them for 10 or 15 minutes and then opens the gate to help them leave. And so, of course, the question is, how did this happen that somebody leaves with 2 bikes and a bunch of Amazon packages like Santa Claus in the middle of the night? And, you know, I posed this to my criminal procedure class. I'm like, guys, how did this happen? And everybody was like, this is impossible. How did it happen? And then we watched the video and you can guess how it happened. The perpetrator was white. And so nobody bothered to believe, because of their implicit biases, that this young white man would be there at 2 o'clock in the morning to rob them. And it just goes to show that our implicit biases cut 2 ways. And there's also, you know, some really great stories about how that works in both directions. But I share that because, Jennifer, as you said, we all have our implicit biases, and it tends to make us treat some people more favorably than they deserve. And it also tends to make us treat other folks less favorably than they deserve. And so one thing that I think is important that we all do is to really examine our own biases and think about what we're just taking for granted in the world, and perhaps stop taking that for granted.
It is 5:30. Now, if you wish to continue, we do have more questions. I am more than willing to continue to keep asking them. Anyone who needs to leave, this is not for CLE. You may leave at any time, and we will continue recording. So, panel, do you wish to continue? All right. Well, this next one is good because, Matt, it's for you. You did talk a little bit about what happened as a response to your stand in favor of Black Lives Matter. Has there been any response that you can share with us from law enforcement in general? Have you had a positive, a negative, a neutral, all of the above? Or is it something perhaps you don't feel comfortable sharing, which would be fine as well?
So, no, I'm comfortable. So whether it's you know, the military in a past life of mine, or law enforcement, if you work in a hospital, whatever, human beings have these, or work in these professions, and so police officers are not unlike, you know, anyone else. They have you know, political views and backgrounds, probably, if we're being honest, 10 more conservative. And you, I don't want to make this political at all, but I mean, this is a year, right? And this is there's a lot of stuff in the air right now. And so there's like, for me, when I wrote what I wrote and tried to relay what I tried to relay, I didn't really see the controversy in that part of it. I'm being honest with you, I really didn't see that as the controversial part of my initial letter. I made a political statement I thought would make some people mad. Maybe I'm Pollyanna, I don't know. I don't think I am. I think I'm pretty cynical, but I didn't expect the general reaction to be so driven by the racial comments and the magic 3 words that I used and challenged everyone to consider and think about. Just the climate we're in, the political climate is just so pitching one group or tribe against another, and everything's binary, and words are misused, and you know, other things are imputed into your own philosophy if you say these words versus these words. And so with respect to law enforcement, I would say the biggest reaction has been from someone who has major bona fides in this community of law enforcement. I see a bit of defensiveness, and I'm saying I've had that over the course of my career too on this same issue. So it's a human reaction. My biggest persuasion points right now are just trying to make everybody open up and not be so defensive, which can be really seen as selfish, you know, in this whole conversation. And I do see not a robust, you know, outrageous defensiveness, but honestly, there's some of that. We got to get over that.
Defensiveness is common, isn't it? When we're being challenged in how we've done things.
Sure.
And I think that I'm going to move on to another question, because I think it kind of falls into this. One area where I have seen a lot of defensiveness when things happen is related to police unions. I think about the man who was knocked over, I think it was in Buffalo, and the police union's response was to withdraw financial support for any of the SWAT team who ended up getting in trouble, their legal support, and then all the SWAT team retired or withdrew from the SWAT team. The union claimed the withdrawal was because of the fact that the 2 officers who were involved in the pushing got charged, but then it turned out, no, they had withdrawn because they were all afraid they'd get in trouble and wouldn't have legal representation. You know, we see responses like that all the time. So Samantha, who has left us, but who was involved in the first conversation, so I think this question deserves to be asked anyway. She says, are there public policy arguments that can be made against union agreements that may hinder police accountability? What do you think? So generally what I guess she's getting at, and what I'm asking also, is are unions, police unions, interfering with change? And what could we possibly do about that, if anything?
So yeah, I will say I think I spoke to this directly before, that yeah, I think that they definitely get in the way of transparency. They definitely get in the way of accountability, because they can undo any desire to have an officer disciplined and or removed from the force. The police union contracts that they've signed. We not only that, but it is a mentality that they take. I mean, I have seen not just here in Philadelphia, but in New York. I've seen it. We've seen it. Saw it in Buffalo. Just the stance that the police union bosses take. It really fuels this us against them sort of mentality. I mean, they blatantly say it. It's us against them, and either you're with us or you're with them, and without and it's them, it's us. It's not this officer that committed this offense, and that's the problem. And that's we've got to be able to hold officers accountable. We've got to be able to hold officers, not only the ones that do the brutality, but the ones that help cover it up, the ones that sign on to the same police report saying that it didn't occur when in fact that it did. We've got to be able to hold those officers accountable for it without having to go up against the whole entire police department, without having to come across as being anti-police, without having to to defend against so many barriers. And this is something that really just doesn't make any sense. Why other than why would the police union or the police boss want to take that stance, other than just trying to reiterate to the officers that you belong to this union because we're gonna stand with you through thick and thin, regardless, and no matter what. And I really would like to know what kind of officers kind of think about that, because I can't believe that every single officer is in favor of what their police heads or police union heads are saying, and what they're thinking about that. I would really like to know, but I think that they're afraid to come out and talk about it, because then they're going to suffer the repercussions that the union's going to bring on them.
Yeah, I want to take a minute to sort of add to this too and expand it out a little bit, because I think that police unions are really a more formalized and legalized approach to a bigger problem of this, again, as Riley has said, this us versus them mentality, but also that manifests itself in ways like the blue wall of silence, which is a term that I imagine that many folks are familiar with, but it's the idea that police will not basically rat out one another. And when you think about what actually happened with the killing of a lot of these Black males that I mentioned at the beginning, there was a cover up before the videos were released. So what happened with George Floyd, they did not initially say that any of those things happened. It was only when the video was released that we actually learned what happened with his death. With Laquan McDonald, it took years for that video to be released. And in the meantime, police officers were lying for one another about what actually happened on those occasions. And it does take a great deal of bravery and fortitude to come forward, because the fear is that you are going to be retaliated against, and that you are going to call for backup, and that nobody is going to come. And so this sort of fear of retaliation and retribution and punishment is a very real thing for people who are putting their lives on the line. And I think that what's happening with police unions is a sort of more formalized idea of some of this. Like, police unions are bargaining for things like having paid for representation when a police has charges against them. They also will indemnify police officers when I should say when there's a civil action against them, that they're paying for representation or representing the police officer when somebody does something like bring a civil action against them. There are also, if it actually results in a settlement or actual finding of liability, the county, because of police agreements, is often indemnifying these officers. And so the people who are ultimately paying for constitutional violations are not police officers, but are taxpayers. Like, we are paying their salaries, and we're paying at the end of the day, even in the face of like found misconduct. And as Riley mentioned before, a lot of these police agreements also make it very difficult to fire police officers. And, you know, we've seen instances and plenty of places where police chief actually sought to remove officers and the police union had them reinstated. And so it's an uphill battle for good police officials in a lot of ways, for good government officers. And I think that we really need to find ways to get their backs and let them know that they're not alone, and that we respect them, that we appreciate the work that they're doing, and that we want the profession to be, you know, to have the honor that it deserves and merits for such an important position. I mean, police officers are the guardians of our liberties and our lives in so many different respects. And it's an important role they play.
Let's talk about qualified immunity. How would removing qualified immunity affect police, and how might it affect the systemic problem we are here to address today? Teri, what do you say?
Yeah, I mean, I write a lot about qualified immunity. I write a lot about qualified immunity, and I think a lot about qualified immunity. The short answer is that qualified immunity is actually a very narrow subject. It's really only applicable in Section 1983 cases. So when you're bringing a civil case against police officials for deprivation of a constitutional right, or not even police officials, but any government officials can raise a qualified immunity defense. It's a really powerful defense because of the way that it intersects with a lot of procedural rules. And so a lot of civil litigation is lost as a consequence of qualified immunity. But it's important to recognize that it's really just operating in this one sphere of the law. As far as what would be the effect of eliminating qualified immunity, there's a lot of predictions about it. On one level, I don't think that it actually makes police more accountable, because even when people overcome the qualified immunity defense, police aren't paying for these violations. And I think it's really important that we understand that. Qualified immunity is based on the assumption that police are paying these judgments. Police are not paying these judgments. Joanna Schwartz, who was at UCLA, did an empirical study a few years ago where she investigated who was actually paying these lawsuits. And she found that that 99% of police officials were being indemnified. And so in that way, it's not going to hold them more accountable. I think that the way that it might work, which becomes very theoretical, is that if police officials know that their municipalities are going to be liable for their misconduct, perhaps they will pause and think twice before they engage in the behavior. For some reason, when the court talks about qualified immunity, they act as if that's a bad thing. I kind of think that, you know, oftentimes I tell my kids, one of whom is at the door right now, please stop and think before you do something. Like, I realize that you often have to, you know, think on your feet, but, you know, pause and make sure you're doing the right thing. And I don't think that it's crazy that we would ask the same of police officials. I don't think that they're going to be over deterred for fear of violating the Constitution, which is often the argument against qualified immunity. But it's really difficult to predict what the effect will be, because the doctrine itself is based on a lot of faulty assumptions.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Okay, so I think we can all agree, and Mr. Fogal, DA Fogal, shows it well. There's a lot of division in how people respond to this issue. So our question from Stephen is, this is also a question of education and police community. How do we get people to understand their own bias, which we talked about a little, when we have a situation where the president has signed an executive order to prohibit training on this issue? So what do you think? I mean, how do we move past the rhetoric and the division and the noise that makes it difficult for people to realize there's a problem in the first place, and a willingness to look into themselves and then a willingness to look outward. How do we deal with that? I mean, this is a philosophical question as much as a legal one, and beyond saying study your implicit bias, you may not have an answer, but what do you say? Any thoughts?
Since no one's jumping in, I mean, I think that on the one hand, it's you got to be willing. You got to be willing to have these conversations. If you don't believe that racism still exists, if you don't believe that racism is the undercurrent for these issues, then it's going to be hard to believe that, to convince you that implicit bias training is necessary. If you don't believe in there is such a thing as white privilege, if you don't believe that the effects of slavery are still around today, it's going to be hard to convince you that implicit bias is necessary. I think that if you have people who are close to you, who are telling you that these things exist now, whether they be white or black, there's a better chance that you may be willing to do it. But you know what? I've grown tired of fighting the people and trying to convince the people who don't want to be convinced of this. I think that my time and energy is better spent with people who are willing to engage in this and making us stronger through that, and finding better ways to eliminate this problem rather than trying to convince someone who doesn't want to be convinced or who doesn't believe that it exists. It's a form of stress, it's a form of poor health for me, and I'd rather spend my time with allies and with people who are willing to be allies and want to learn. I don't know everything. I want to learn. I want to learn about other cultures. I want to learn about other religions, other practices. It's not that I'm even the authority on things that of groups that I'm a part of. You know, I want to still learn about things, and if someone's not willing to learn and not willing to grow in that respect, I just, life is too short to spend that much time with them. I get more enjoyment, and I think I advance the ball more and with people who are willing to do that.
If I may,
Yeah,
Matt,
I was gonna, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Matt.
Matt, did you?
No, please go ahead.
Kelley, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I echo everything that Riley just said. It's exhausting, and these past 3 months from May until now have been particularly exhausting, in addition to addressing COVID and being a Black person in America. And we know that this just didn't happen. On May 25th, I said my analogy was, you have a pandemic woven within another pandemic, and one they're actively trying to find a vaccine for, and the other one nobody has cared about looking for a vaccine for it, but yet we probably have a better opportunity to create a vaccine for racism if people were willing to actually commit to looking within themselves and acknowledging their behaviors and their thought processes and making adjustments accordingly. I too don't have the energy really to try to lead the horse to water and make them drink if they're not willing to drink. I think that it is much more beneficial on a personal level as well as a professional level to try to work alongside those individuals and with allies who are in positions to make change, who are singing the same tune that I'm singing, and who believe in the same things that I believe are important in order to make sure everything's fair for everyone across the board. And so I think that, 1619 is now, known by many more people, and Juneteenth, than people did back before, after George Floyd's death. And so people have become much more aware. And now that they have the awareness, it's what are they going to do about it? And the ones who choose to still subscribe to this fantasy that racism doesn't exist, I really don't have the time or energy to try to tell them that it does. Clearly, they're in a different space. I do think generationally that the younger generation I'm putting all my eggs almost in that basket, because I do feel like they have a perspective and an energy and an awareness and a passion that is different than mine and different than those who preceded me that are older than me. And so I believe that there's a true potential. I am an optimist for things to be better than they are now. And that's what I'm looking for. And for those who are kind of set in their ways, I am not really looking to invest in that conversation.
Matt?
You
You're
just
muted.
yourself.
First, Kelley, thank you for those words. I couldn't say anything at the time. I appreciate that. That's honestly a highlight of my life to hear you say that to me. So thank you so much. So I'll go on a limb here and just say, you know, when we talk about race in this country, I think it's sometimes frustrating to me to know that we only seem to really have a national conversation after some tragedy involving police. And so the sort of knee-jerk reaction seems to be to do some police reform. And just from my own perspective, for what it's worth, when in my initial letter, again, I encouraged everyone to keep this momentum going and to go bigger than this, not to diminish, you know, the impact in criminal justice and law enforcement, but there are historic systemic issues that I think if we capture this momentum and movement, I don't know exactly what those answers are. But you know, I think sometimes from my observations and probably some of my own experience, if I'm being honest, there's a, you know, you learn about, you know, slavery and the Civil War, and you know, patriotism is something that, you know, is talked about a lot. You love your country and love our history and what we stand for. And it's hard, I think, for some Americans, particularly white Americans, to figure out how that all fits together. Like there's this greatness of our country and our founding and our history. And yeah, we, you know, wear red, white, and blue things, and that's good. But yet there's this birth defect and there's this original sin. And I think it maybe is compartmentalized and just kind of, because it's hard to put it together for some folks. It's really difficult. I think for someone to really consider all of it and to really get at the root of the problem, that has to, I don't know if this is helpful, but there has to be a breakthrough there, I think, with a lot of folks. Maybe there's new ways to, I don't know, present that or talk about it in such a way, because there's, make no mistake, there's an active resistance. You know, you mentioned 1619. There's obviously now a counter to that that's been introduced as a suggested nationally. So the active resistance in the middle of this movement has surprised me.
You know what, I appreciate those comments, Matt. And one thing I would sort of add to all of this, and something that I actually think is a little bit more hopeful, because we've talked about being optimist and we've talked about moving forward, is how we, like, what leaders we choose to focus on. We often talk about this as a national conversation, but one of the things that I think is really important to highlight is that changes are happening on a lot of smaller levels, that we're engaging, you know, maybe not in the sort of the national forum. Like, yeah, the police reform bills stalled out in both the House and in the Senate, but we actually see what's starting to happen on state levels and local levels, and that we're really able to engage there, and we're really moving forward with some reform there. And you know, one of the phrases that I've heard a lot lately is that small is the new big. And I think that, frankly, when we take stock of where we are in this country with the unfortunate death of, you know, the esteemed Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it's a lot of questions about what moving forward is going to look like. And there have been plenty of other times in this country where we didn't look to the federal government for change. And we might be entering into a point where we don't stop seeking change, but perhaps we start knocking on some different doors and we start paying more attention to what's happening on state and local levels and places where we might frankly be more likely to have success and might forge new allies. And, I think that we have to think creatively about how to move forward and how to get the reform that we want and need, because some of it is not going to come from our executive leadership. And if we're hoping for change there, it will come through the form of election, not some epiphany from our current president.
With that, since it is 5 of 6, as much as I appreciate your willingness to continue talking with us, I think we do need to end. Obviously, this program could continue for forever. I'm sorry if not everyone had a chance to ask questions, or if I didn't get to your question or comment, I do apologize, but it is time to end. So I'm going to hand it over to Melinda. My thanks to all of the participants and the attendees, as well as, and to those of you who decide to watch this later. I hope that it has an impact on you, as it has, I think, on everyone who's watched today. Melinda.
Thank you, Jennifer. On behalf of Nancy Conrad and our other co-chair, Phil Yoon, I would just like to thank all of you for participating in this very impactful discussion this afternoon. And I think that this probably is a good time to end, because certainly not all has been said and done, but it's going to sort of allow us to clamor for more. And it will give the diversity team an opportunity to present part 4, so to speak. This was part 3. So we look forward to continuing this conversation and discussion, and hope that all of you will join us in that continued endeavor. Before I end, I want to end as Nancy started, to remind you about the Diversity Summit, which is scheduled for October 7th. There is registration information about that through PBI. I plan to attend, and I hope that you will attend as well. And also an event on September 25th, which is diversity in the COVID environment. And our own PBA diversity officer, Trent Hargrove, will be the moderator of that program. And that is a PBI program as well. So the information to register for both of those programs is available on the PBI website. Thank you again very much to all of our participants and our moderator extraordinaire. We look forward to seeing you for our next conversation. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.